Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal employees are getting more details on what to expect if they appeal an adverse action. That's after the Office of Personnel Management finalized an overhaul to the government's avenues for challenging agencies. Here to break down the latest from OPM's guidance is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Terry.
All right, let's start with context. How will these three final rules from OPM change the appeals process?
Well, if you're looking at these three final rules as a whole and combined, this is going to change the process pretty significantly for federal employees. This isn't the case if they're wanting to dispute or challenge an agency if they were, for example, fired or demoted, and it'll cover instances where there's been some sort of adverse action during either a reduction in force or RIF for short for employees while serving on a probationary period, and then also any actions that are taken due to a suitability related reason. So starting next month on September 2nd, it will be OPM rather than the Merit Systems Protection Board who's going to be managing this full adjudication process for appeals that employees file across all three of those categories. That authority has been with the MSPB since the 1970s, so since the MSPB was created. So this is going to be a very significant shift, both for what things look like internally at OPM, also for the process and what employees are going to see on their end. We saw more details come out after these final rules with guidance from OPM that talks about how this is going to look once it's all implemented.
And how will that timeline change from the old appeals process now to going through OPM?
So the timeline is going to seem pretty similar in terms of how long employees have. Employees will get 30 days to file their appeal with OPM after the adverse action takes place. Agencies will then have another 30 days to file their response. Then following that, employees get 15 days to, if they want to, for example, submit additional allegations if something new arises based on what the agency files. So a little bit of back and forth there. And then once OPM has all of that written documentation, adjudicators within OPM will be reviewing the case, issue an initial decision, which can then maybe be appealed if one of the parties decides they want to do that. And then from there, OPM will make a final decision if there is an appeal, or their initial decision will become final after 30 days if there's not an appeal. There's also going to now be something new coming once this moves to OPM. There's now going to be the possibility of what's called a director review. So what's going to happen there is that before a decision becomes final, OPM's guidance says that the OPM director has the authority or the ability to review the case and maybe issue some sort of other decision if there's extenuating circumstances or in some of these more severe cases, so to speak.
One of the claims about processing an appeal through MSPB used to be the duration of the process. Do you have a sense that with OPM taking this over that they'll actually be able to hold to these timelines and get decisions at a faster pace?
It's a great question. It seems like we're going to have to see how OPM handles this, but we do know that at MSPB, it does take a while, sometimes months or even a year or more, for them to issue a decision and get through the entire process for an appeal. With OPM, what they're saying and what they talk about in the final rule is that this is a move to streamline things, to make things faster. One way they are trying to speed things up is pretty notably by removing the right for federal employees to have a hearing or a formal investigation. In the vast majority of cases, OPM will rely only on the written record of what employees submit and what agencies submit to make their decisions. There will only be a hearing involved in very specific cases, and if OPM determines that there needs to be one. That's a huge shift from what we see at MSPB right now, where every employee who submits an appeal or files some sort of challenge against their agency, they have a right to a hearing, a right to an investigation, and there's a much more thorough process there. That's raised, while OPM says that that's meant to speed up the process, that's raised a lot of concerns on the other end of how that's going to change things for employees and potential for them not to get a fair or full process of their appeal.
Well, that is no small change. Are there other parts of the process that will be different that employees should be paying attention to?
So that's definitely the most notable one, to have just the removal of those steps in the process. But if you look, more generally at how this is going to transition into OPM, it's important to note where within the agency this work is going to take place. So OPM's what's called their Merit System Accountability and Compliance, or MSAC office for short, they're going to be handling all the appeals for RIF and probationary appeals going forward. And once that September 2nd date hits, that's important because looking contextually at what MSAC does right now is they adjudicate appeals from employees that are based on any issues with compensation and leave. So they do have some adjudicatory work in their background, but there have been concerns there as well about the processes for looking at challenges during a termination or some sort of adverse action. That's not something that MSAC has historically done. So there's some concerns about how this is going to transfer. And also not to mention that MSAC and OPM more broadly had a large staffing reduction last year. So they have less capacities to take on this work at the same time.
These rules are now final, so we'll presume that the federal workforce advocacy organizations made their comments during that process. But what's the reaction now that the rules are final and getting ready to go into the implementation stage?
It seems like there is an air of caution or some sort of concern about how this is going to play out. If you look back to the comments that were submitted when OPM first proposed these regulations, there was a lot of commentary in opposition and that was concerned about how this is going to change the process. Specifically, if you look at the proposed regulation to change the appeal process during reductions in force, it was determined that 99% of commenters were opposed to the change, and OPM still finalized it and made mention of that in their final rule. But I think that just tells you how the federal community is feeling about these changes. Again, there's concerns about the loss of a fair process, the loss of potentially due process for federal employees, and then OPM's own capacity to take on a lot of this work, which has been at MSPB, and they have that experience for decades now at OPM. This is going to be a brand new process. So, at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a matter of seeing how this plays out over the next couple of months. But there's definitely a sense of wariness, I would say, from people who are following this.
Are there folks who are anticipating legal challenges to the final rules?
There is, I believe, some pending litigation against this, so we'll see if that plays out as well. There might be more down the pipeline as well as this kind of plays out and just seeing how MSAC and how OPM actually handle this process.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks as always.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.